Welcome, travelers of the night. Before we cross the threshold into the forgotten corridors of time, tell me, where do you rest this evening? Are you curled beneath linen sheets in Delhi, the city lights casting silent prayers on your wall? Or has the hush of midnight settled over your cabin deep in the Canadian woods, the wind whispering lullabies through the pines? Wherever the night has found you, I invite you now to step into the quiet murmur of the past, to let go of the present, to fall backward into history's shadow, where truth wears the veil of silence and echoes drift endlessly through marble halls, long turned to dust. And tonight, we begin where silence is loudest. In the sick room of a city built on salt and stone, a city whose beauty was so staggering, it was said even angels paused to admire it. But no angel came when the ships returned, and no God stirred when the bells began to toll. Let your modern burdens slip away, sink deeper into the dark. For this is the story, of how death came sailing into Venice. Asterisk. It begins, not with screams, nor fire, nor war. It begins with stillness. A late summer stillness, where the sea itself holds its breath. The year is 1347. The city of Venice floats, as it always has, like a dream upon the water. 1,000 stone buildings rise like coral reefs from the lagoon, their windows catching the golden hush of dusk. Gondolas glide silently through narrow canals. The markets have quieted. The bells of San Marco have long since fallen silent, and on the horizon, just beyond the Lido, 3 ships wait. They are galleys, heavy with spice and silk, their sails limp against the still air. They do not lower anchor. They do not raise flags. They drift, waiting. The people of Venice do not yet know it, but death has arrived, and it is hungry. You see, these are not ordinary ships. They belong to the Zeno family, proud merchants who had traded in Constantinople before the coughing began, before the red boils burst beneath the skin, before the screaming started. The sailors on these ships have not spoken in days. Some have no tongues left to speak with. Others are dead, curled like dried fish in the shadows of the hold. But even now the ships must dock. Venice needs the grain. The Doge, seated high on his throne beneath tapestries of gold, signs the order to let the galleys through, and thus the gates open. No one screams at first. The disease is slow in its first steps, like a candle flickering before it finds its flame. A few men fall ill in the arsenal. A priest collapses in his chapel. A baker's wife coughs once, twice, and bleeds from the nose before morning. By the end of the week, there are 50 dead. By the end of the month, thousands. Asterisk. Picture this, a narrow Venetian alley just after midnight. The mist clings to the bricks like wet cloth. Somewhere, a window slams shut. Somewhere else, a footstep echoes. And then nothing. The canals are quieter now. The gondolas no longer sing. The oarsmen wear scarves over their faces, though none know if it helps. On the doors of the infected, a red mark is painted. A warning, a death sentence. Behind those doors, a mother cradles a child who no longer breathes. A merchant counts coins, not to buy food, but to pay the priest to bury his wife. The scent of rosemary clings to the air, not for beauty, but to mask the rot. It does not work. Asterisk. Venice was no stranger to hardship. It had withstood siege, flood, fire. It had seen invaders claw at its lagoon shores, only to sink beneath its brackish tides. But never this. Never an enemy so small it could ride on breath, on cloth, on fleas hiding in the fur of a rat. The government tried. Oh, they tried. Quarantine was declared. A lazaretto was constructed on a distant island. Ships were barred from entering the harbor without inspection. Men in beaked masks, plague doctors, were sent into the city like carrion. Birds dressed in black. But the enemy was already inside, and so the people prayed. In the basilica, hundreds knelt beneath a ceiling of stars painted in lapis blue. They lit candles until the air grew thick with smoke. They offered gold, livestock, promises. But the bells kept tolling. One for a merchant, another for a child, another for a nun who had nursed the dying until her hands grew black dot, each chime a requiem, each note a tear in the fabric of the world. Asterisk, asterisk, and as the bodies piled higher, the people began to ask, why? Was it sin? Had they displeased God? Had the ships brought, not just death, but judgment? Some said yes, that the Black Death was a punishment for vanity, for greed, for the gold that sparkled too brightly in the markets of Rialto. Others whispered of older things, of ancient curses, of demons that stirred in the east and rode westward on the sails of trade. But the truth, perhaps, was simpler. A flea, a rat, a ship, and the unstoppable greed of men who would rather risk death than lose a profit. Asterisk, asterisk, in this hysteria, 6 districts of the city, the living learned to step over the dead. Streets once filled with laughter now held only sobs and silence. The lagoon, once glittering, now bore the reflections of funeral barges. The fish stopped biting. The birds stopped singing. Even the dogs left, and in this silence, something ancient was born, not rage, not rebellion, but resignation. For what can man do when death knocks at every door? He waits, he watches, he prays, and sometimes he begins to forget the faces of the dead. Asterisk, asterisk, but the story of Venice and the plague does not end with bells and ashes, for in the shadow of despair, something stirred, a new kind of courage, a quiet defiance, a plan whispered in candlelight behind locked doors. Not all had succumbed, not all had fled. Some had begun to fight back, not with swords, but with ideas, and in part 2 of our journey, we follow them through the hidden passageways of a dying city into the birth of a new way of surviving, a new kind of war, waged not on battlefields, but in silence, in shadows, where masks and memory became mankind's only weapons. Venice had grown quieter, and not only from the absence of footsteps on stone, or voices across market squares. It was a different quiet, now deeper, heavier, as though the city itself had taken a breath and forgotten how to let it go. The waters no longer carried laughter or love songs. The echoing songs of gondoliers, once drifting between palazzos like melodies suspended in time, had gone silent. The oars moved, still, but more slowly now, dipped into the dark water with reverent caution, like each stroke disturbed something sacred beneath the surface. At the fish market near San Polo, the pigeons still gathered, as though unaware that the hands which once scattered crumbs had long since gone cold. A single fisherman Venice stood at his stall, the catch before him untouched, eyes darting to every passer-by, though there were few. His son had taken sick 2 days before. His wife was already buried. He no longer called out his prices. He no longer called out at all. He just stood there, every morning, a statue with salt on his skin, and a prayer stuck behind his teeth. In the churches, incense clung to stone and velvet. It did little to hide the smell of decay that now seeped through the floorboards. Some said the plague could pass through breath, others through touch, still others through the glance of a cursed man, but no one knew. And in the space between, knowing and fearing, silence festered. The priests still came, though fewer now. Some arrived with masks shaped like beaks, the noses stuffed with herbs and petals. Others wore no mask at all, merely crossing themselves again and again as they anointed foreheads slick with sweat and death. The confessions whispered in those hours were not of pride or theft, but of desperation. Fathers who had fled their homes to avoid infecting their children. Mothers who had locked sick husbands away. Sisters who had denied entry to brothers. Sins shaped not by cruelty but by the trembling will to survive. Even the bells, so constant once, had grown weary. They rang less often, and when they did, they rang not with urgency, but with exhaustion. They tolled like hearts, too tired to keep beating at times. It was not the sound of bells that reached across rooftops, but the wailing of widows. From high windows, from behind shuttered doors, the city mourned aloud, and yet, even in the shadow of so much death, life stirred. Not boldly, not loudly, but it stirred. In a small room above a glassmaker's shop near Murano, a young woman named Alessia lit a candle. Her hands were stained with soot, not from mourning, but from ink and wax. She had begun to write letters. First, then poems. Now names. Names of those who had passed. She did not know them all, but she collected their names like pearls. Her pages filled slowly in act of defiance, perhaps, or simply remembrance. In a city where memory was becoming fog, she had decided to preserve what she could before it drifted away. Below her, the furnace still glowed, though no glass was blown anymore. Her father had worked that fire all his life. It still burned because she kept it fed not to shape beauty, but to boil water. For the sick, for herself. The artistry of Venice was no longer in what could be made, but in what could be endured. On the other side of the canal, beneath the dark arches of the Scuola Grande, a physician moved between beds. Not a plague doctor, not anymore. His mask lay abandoned, its hollow eyes staring from a shelf. He had begun to work barefaced. He said it made the dying feel less alone. His name was Matteo, and his coat was no longer black, but a blotchy gray. From ash and time, he whispered stories to his patients as they faded, believing that dreams could take root in the final moments if spoken softly enough. Tales of gardens untouched by death, of cities where the air was sweet, of shores where no ship ever docked with sickness in its belly. Many passed before his words ended. Still, he kept telling them. There were others, quiet lights in a darkening world. A midwife who had begun treating men because all the other healers were gone. A gondolier who ferried the dead not for coin, but because he could not bear to let them drift alone. A cook who left bread at the doors marked with red and knocked once, never waiting for thanks. No grand declarations, no proclamations of courage. Just human hands doing what they could, with what they had, when no one else could. Still, the sickness spread. The air grew heavier with each week, as though the city itself inhaled the stench of rot and held it within its marble bones. The courtyards where lovers had once met were now empty. The colonnades of the Doge's palace echoed with the scurrying of rats. Even the pigeons had begun to vanish, as though drawn elsewhere by some instinct too deep to name. The Doge himself had not been seen for days. Rumors swirled that he had fled to the hills, that he had sealed himself in the palace, that he had perished and been replaced by a double. No one knew, and none dared ask. The government still sent proclamations, pinned to doors by pale servants, wearing gloves soaked in vinegar, but the words felt hollow. The laws crumbled faster than the bodies they tried to protect. Quarantine zones were established, bridges closed, guards posted, but the plague laughed at barriers. It flowed not like water, but like smoke through cracks, through cloth, through breath. The islands meant to contain the sick were themselves swallowed. Lazarettos once intended. Too isolate became tombs. No boat left once it entered. From the city, the cries could still be heard across the water, and yet, not all wept. In a crumbling theater at the edge of Castello, a boy stood on the stage. No audience, no applause, just him and the echoes of performances long past. He had found an old mask, half gold, half black, and he wore it as he moved. Slowly, deliberately, like a memory trying to remember itself. He danced, for no one, for everyone, for the idea that beauty, though wounded, was not dead. Because somewhere, in the bones of Venice, something ancient still breathed, not merely the plague, but the city itself. The spirit of stone that refused to crack. The song that lingered even after the singer fell silent. The soft lapping of water against steps, repeating and repeating, like a prayer in another language. Long forgotten, but still recited by the soul. Night deepened. Above, the stars blinked faintly through layers of fog. The moon, pale and patient, watched as gondolas moved like shadows, and lanterns flickered like fireflies caught in amber. Venice did not sleep. It drifted half dream, half dirge. In a narrow room by the old pharmacy, an old woman boiled lavender, and mint and tied them in sachets. She placed them beneath pillows of the dying, not to cure, but to ease the scent of fear. She spoke to them softly, stories passed down from her grandmother, stories of angels who once danced across rooftops and left no footprints. She said the angels would return. She always said it, even now, even when her own cough began to rattle in her chest like coins in a beggar's cup. And the city listened, because stories, like prayers, held power not to cure, but to remind. Remind that this was not the end, that beneath the silence, beneath the stench, beneath the blood and ash, and bone, something still waited. Hope, perhaps, or defiance, or simply the next breath. No one knew what tomorrow would bring, but the city, broken as it was, still floated, still reflected moonlight, still carried the weight of the world on its spires and statues. The ships that had brought the plague had long since rotted at the edge of the harbor, their hulls split, their sails torn, but the memory of their arrival lingered, and the city remembered. It always would. For cities are not merely built of brick and stone, but of memory, of loss, of those who remained when others fled, and of the stories whispered when the world holds its breath. It was the hour before dawn, when dreams cling to the edges of waking, and the soul forgets whether it belongs to the night or the day. A thin mist wrapped itself around the alleys of Venice like an old shawl, worn and soft, carrying the scent of smoke, salt, and something older, something not quite nameable. The silence, by now familiar, felt deeper than before. Not simply the absence of noise, but the presence of waiting. The city waited. Venice, once so proud, so arrogant in its beauty, now bent her head like a widow at the edge of the sea. Her towers still stood, her domes still caught the fading starlight, but something inside her had changed. Not broken, no. Venice did not break. But something inside her had shifted, like a song gone out of tune, or a painting left half-finished. And yet, life moved. In a weather-beaten palazzo that had once belonged to a family of spice merchants, a small girl paced across a marble floor, cracked with time. Her name was Amelia, and she had seen 5 winters. Her hair was tangled, her clothes too large. Her father had not returned in 3 days. Her mother lay upstairs, silent and still. But Amelia, too young to understand death, still spoke to her mother each morning. She brought her wilted flowers plucked from the empty gardens. She hummed lullabies to the stillness. She fed a cat that no longer came. Amelia was not alone. Across the city, children wandered like ghosts through the shells of their homes. Some waited for parents who would never return. Others had already buried their names in silence. But they moved with a quiet purpose, fetching water, lighting candles, speaking in whispers to the statues that watched from rooftops. They had grown old too fast. Yet they still played, sometimes games without laughter. Hide and seek in shuttered chapels, drawing maps in ash, pretending they were queens, or captains, or saints, anything other than orphans of a dying city. In the former wine district, where barrels once rolled like thunder and laughter spilled louder than the tides, a new sound had emerged, scraping, hammering, the rhythm of nails into wood. Men with hollow eyes and dust-colored hands built coffins by the dozens. They no longer prayed, they no longer wept. They simply worked. The living needed shelter. The dead needed rest. Which became both house and grave. Nearby, the Brotherhood of Saint Zachariah lit torches before dawn. Not to illuminate the faithful, for few remained, but to lead carts through the streets. Covered wagons, drawn by exhausted mules, collected the bodies left on steps, in corners, by fountains. The brothers whispered psalms as they walked, their robes dragging across stone. They did not look into the faces of the dead. They did not need to. Death had become as familiar as bread, and far more common. And yet, within the monastery walls, the monks still wrote. Illuminated manuscripts, though the gold leaf was gone, traded for grain. They wrote, not of saints and miracles, but of what they saw, the days of the plague, the numbers, the names, the dreams. They chronicled not to glorify, but to remember, to preserve, so that if the city vanished, its memory would not. One monk, Brother Luca, kept a separate ledger. It was hidden beneath the altar, inked by candlelight when the others slept. In it, he recorded not just the deaths, but the silences. The houses never opened, the prayers never finished. the songs never sung. He believed that the absence of things was just as holy as their presence, and so he wrote every silence, every pause, every breath that never came. Far from the monastery, across the water near Giudecca, a strange house had begun to draw whispers. It was not marked with a red sign of plague, but people crossed themselves when they passed. The windows were always closed, the door never opened, and yet smoke curled from the chimney. Inside lived a woman called Daria. She had once been a healer, midwife, herbalist, to some, a witch. When the sickness began, they came to her with offerings, eggs, wine, relics, coins asking for charms, for protection. She gave what she could, poultices, dried petals, words passed down from her grandmother. But when the plague devoured her, own brother Daria stopped seeing visitors. She locked the doors. She spoke only to her cat, and she waited, but she did not abandon her work. From behind shuttered windows, she watched, listened, took notes. She began to notice patterns, certain smells that lingered before death, the way some lived while others perished. She boiled herbs, late into the night, not for spells, but for science, for something like understanding. She believed the plague could be unraveled, not cured, perhaps, but known. Her journals grew thick, pages bound with twine, covered in neat, tiny script. She spoke to no one, but her words would outlive her. She wrote for a future she would never see, a world where someone might read her notes and say, here is where the pattern began. And so Venice pulsed faintly, like a candle in its final hours. But it pulsed. Each quarter of the city became its own island. Cannaregio kept to itself. San Marco watched in silence. Dorsoduro, thin and weary, still lit lanterns on feast days, though the saints no longer answered. Bridges, once crowded with markets and music, now echoed with footsteps like whispers. Some believed the city was cursed. Others believed it was blessed to still stand. The truth, as always, lay somewhere in between, in the arsenal, where ships were once born. The forges still glowed, but not for war. Now they forged hinges for coffins, hooks for pulleys to lower the dead. The workers no longer chanted as they had in better days, but they moved with rhythm still, the rhythm of endurance, of duty, of breath. A young apprentice named Tomas worked through the night, shaping iron not with pride, but with necessity. His older brother had once been a captain. Tomas wore his ring now, a tarnished band with a single stone. When the fires grew too hot, he would clutch the ring and imagine waves, winds, sails filled with the breath of adventure. He had never left the city, but he dreamed of it, of escape, of motion, of being anywhere but here. Dreams, in those days, became anchors. Those who stopped dreaming drifted away faster. Hope was not grand. It did not shout, but it lingered in corners, in candlelight, in the sound of wind between buildings. And in that wind, something stirred. Not the plague, not fear, but something older. Deeper. Venice had seen plagues before. Fires, floods, wars, and each time she had rebuilt herself, more beautiful, more strange. Her people had always been shaped by contradiction, pious and decadent, joyous and cruel, tender and ruthless. Now she was being shaped again not by wealth or art, but by survival, and from that shaping, something new would emerge. Even now, as funerals replaced weddings, as prayer replaced poetry, something new was being born. Quietly, in the shadows, it was not joy, not yet, but it was something close to meaning. A gondola drifted through the Grand Canal, its black hull gliding over water like a raven across snow. Inside sat a single passenger, an old man with silver hair, wrapped in velvet. His face was marked with age, not fear. He hummed softly, a song from his childhood, as the oarsman guided the boat beneath stone arches and silent bridges. He was not going anywhere. He simply wanted to see the city one last time, to remember her not as she was, but as she endured. For even in death, Venice was alive. Even in silence, she spoke. Even in despair, she dreamed. And as the sun began to rise, a thin sliver of gold against the gray sky, The city glowed, just faintly, just enough. And in that glow, the story continued. Because stories do not end with endings, they end with remembering. The moon had not yet vanished when the first ferry bell sounded, in the distance a hollow chime that rolled across the lagoon like a memory, unsure of where it belonged. It was not a call to gather. There were no more crowds, no more eager passengers, with trunks and papers, laughter caught on the wind. This bell was softer now, almost accidental, swaying in the morning hush, like a wind chime strung from the fingers of the dead. Venice was still awake, not bustling, not vibrant, but awake in the way ancient creatures sleep with one eye open. The city no longer trusted the light. It had learned, too often, that what emerged in the dawn was no different from what crouched in the dark. And so it moved slowly, like breath, through cracked lips, cautious but steady. In a cloistered courtyard, once filled with olive trees, where lovers once carved initials into bark, and artists sketched the play of light through leaves, a man named Antonio tended to silence. His garden was bare. Now roots turned to rot, soil blackened by salt. But he came each day, wrapped in wool, walking with a limp, carrying a bucket of rainwater drawn from his rooftop cistern. He watered nothing. He said the ground still remembered, that roots, even dead ones, listened, that the earth grieved with us, and deserved to be spoken to. Antonio had lost his daughter in the second wave. His wife had not spoken since, but each morning he came to the garden, poured water over dead roots, whispered a name, and waited, not for miracles, just for the next morning. Across the canal, the bells of Santa Maria de Miracoli rang in time with his rituals, not by design. The bell ringer, an old blind woman named Carmela, knew nothing of Antonio, but she too had built her own rhythm for the world, a system of sound to keep the silence from pressing in too tightly. She rang once for sunrise, twice for rain, 3 times for no reason at all. She believed the sound carried across the city, tucked itself into the corners of empty rooms and behind the curtains of abandoned theaters, reminding the shadows that someone still remained, someone still watching, someone still listening. And so, though the city had lost so much its color, its song, its heartbeat, threads remained. Invisible threads, woven not by decree or government, but by ordinary hands carrying out ordinary acts. Quiet resistance against oblivion in the scriptorium of a forgotten abbey. A woman named Serafina copied old texts by oil lamp. Her fingers were blistered, ink-stained, fragile with cold. The abbey was abandoned. She had broken in during the early days of the quarantine. At first, she had come to steal blank paper, dry bread, anything that might help her last another week. But when she stumbled upon the library, she stayed. She read first, then she copied page after page. Scripture, folklore, recipes, cures, myths, lists of saints. She copied them not for anyone else, but because she could not bear the thought of them disappearing. The plague had taken voices, faces, generations. She refused to let it take words. Her copies were scattered now across the city, left in doorways, slipped into empty prayer books, hidden in alcoves behind statues. She signed none of them, but the people called her the shadow scribe, a ghost that preserved what the living forgot elsewhere. A carpenter named Benedetto began building chairs, not coffins. Chairs, each one different, painted in strange colors: blue like bruised sky, yellow like candle wax, green like mold. He placed them across the city, one by one, in piazzas, in alleys, on docks. No two ever together. No one knew why. They were not for sitting. Not really. But he said they marked the people who once stood there. The lovers who danced in Campo. San Luca, the merchant who played flute near the fish market. The widow who fed birds outside the basilica. He carved their names into the legs, barely visible. Unless you knelt close, it was a map, he said. A map of absences. And so the city changed, not in grand ways, but in strange ones, no longer a place of trade, but a vessel of mourning, a mirror to what had been lost, a poem written in plague. The canals ran slower now, as if even the tides were tired. The water reflected the sky with less clarity. Murano glass, once molten and vibrant, cooled in forgotten kilns. The doves of San Marco flew lower. The lion statues stared longer. Time itself seemed reluctant to pass. But pass it did, for seasons do not stop, even when hearts do. And as autumn gave way to winter, the sickness changed. Not weaker, just quieter. The death toll slowed. The bells tolled less often. Not because grief had lessened, but because the city could no longer spare the strength to ring them. And yet, in the ruins of the Teatro Malabrane, beneath torn velvet curtains and cracked chandeliers, a girl sang. Her name was Her voice had not been heard for weeks, not since her mother, a famed soprano, died Medaria one cursed night. Isolde had not sung since, until now it began as a whisper, not even a melody, just breath with shape. Then came tone, then a note, then a song, not her mother's aria, not a sacred hymn, but a lullaby, one Isolde barely remembered, from a nursemaid long gone. And in that ruined theater, the song filled the air like incense. No audience, no stage, no applause, just a voice meeting silence and daring to continue. Someone wept in the shadows. It may have been the caretaker, it may have been the city. Some stories do not end. They linger like perfume caught in lace, or fingerprints on a glass. And Venice lingered on the steps of Cadoro. A woman left loaves of bread each dusk. No one saw her arrive or leave. The loaves were still warm. The pigeons knew her, in the bell tower of San Giorgio. A boy with one arm learned to chime the hours with his elbow. He had lost his father to fever. He had lost his voice to grief. But he kept the hours. And beneath the bridge of sighs, someone lit candles every night at midnight, 12 small flames floating on driftwood, carried by the current until they vanished beneath the fog. Even as the sickness ebbed, the habits of mourning did not dot. They became the new customs, the new culture. The city had learned to dress itself in shadow, but the sun still rose. One morning, and like any other, boat arrived, small, painted white, unmarked, no flag, no cargo, just a woman standing at the prow, hair the color of rust, cloak caught in the wind. She said nothing. She tied the boat to the dock near the arsenal and stepped ashore. Some said she brought medicine. Others said she was death herself, returning to take back what she'd forgotten. But no one stopped her. She walked the length of the city. She entered. No house. She knocked on no door. She stood in the center of Piazza San Marco, turned once in place, looked to the sky, and whispered a word no one could hear. Then she left, and from that day, the plague began to retreat. No cure, no miracle, just less death and more silence. But not the kind born from terror, the kind born from reverence. Venice did not cheer, did not rejoice. She simply breathed, and it was enough. It was the beginning of remembering, and remembering is where healing begins, not with answers, but with stories. And so the city, remembered through candles, through ink, through empty chairs, through lullabies, through footsteps on broken bridges, through names carved into stone. Venice, the city of masks, had removed hers at last, and what remained beneath was not horror, but endurance, not ruin, but rhythm, and still. Beneath it all, the water flowed, whispering its ancient lullaby, that nothing ends, not truly, not while someone remembers, not while someone listens, not while the story continues. The fog came back slowly, like an old friend returning not with menace, but with memory. It moved through the alleys like breath from an ancient lungpool, fragrant with salt, and thick enough to make the lamps look like floating stars in a city that no longer believed in constellations. Venice had learned to walk through it without fear now. The mist had once signaled death, ghost ships, funeral carts, and final prayers. But now, it meant morning. It meant another day had arrived, another had passed, and that was enough. The plague had not vanished. It never truly does. Sickness lingers in more than bodies. It lingers in the bones of cities, in their habits, in the way they hesitate before joy. But the dying had slowed, like a pendulum settling after long hours of trembling. The bells still rang, but with purpose, not panic. The carts still rolled, but now they carried bread and blankets. The worst was behind them, though no one dared say it aloud. In the Grand Canal, gondolas returned not in parade, but in solitude. One by one, they slipped through the water like ink lines drawn across a wet page. Their oars no longer splashed with urgency, but moved with calm grace. The gondoliers sang again quietly, songs half remembered from childhood, lullabies stitched together from dialects and sighs. Songs not meant to entertain, but to soothe the water, as if even the canals needed healing. On the northern edge of Cannaregio, an old bakery reopened its shutters. The woman who ran it, Lucretia, had once baked for the Doge's table. Her hands, gnarled and flour-covered, moved slower, now but still with care. She no longer sold her pastries. She gave them away. 2 children, 2 mourners, to those who still flinched at sudden sounds. She said sweetness was the only coin worth using in the aftermath of sorrow. Each morning, before sunrise, she lit a candle in her window, not to light her path, but to guide the lost. She said it was for her husband, who had never come home, but everyone in the neighborhood knew it. Was for all of them, for the living who didn't know how to live anymore, for the dead who might still be searching for a place to rest, for the city itself. On the island of San Michel, where the dead were buried above the tide, new rituals had taken root. Families no longer wept at graves, they whispered. They sat on the stones, read aloud from letters, shared gossip with the dead, as though they were merely away for a time. They brought violins, danced barefoot, left wine instead of flowers. They did not do it for grief. They did it to anchor memory, because forgetting was the final death. In the heart of the city, a boy named Matteo had begun drawing again. He had not lifted charcoal to parchment in many months, not since the day his sister died in his arms. She had loved drawing, had taught him to blend color with soot, had once sketched every door of Venice, as if they were faces in a crowd. Now, Matteo walked the city with a satchel of scrap paper and a single pencil. He did not draw people anymore. He drew shadows. He traced the outlines of statues at dusk. He captured the shape of fog on water. He sketched the light that pooled beneath broken stained glass windows. He said he was trying to draw absence, trying to make something out of nothing, trying to prove that what was lost still shaped what remained. His drawings began to appear in unexpected places, tucked into the hands of marble saints, pinned to the robes of empty shrines, woven into the folds of laundry left to dry between buildings. People started, leaving notes in return, a message on the back of a grocery list. You drew my grief. Thank you. A poem scribbled in broken Latin. The fog is not the end. It is the veil before something else. A child's stick figure drawing of a family, labeled with names, including one crossed out in red. The city was beginning to speak again, not in sermons, but in scribbles. Not in declarations, but in murmurs, like the first cracking of ice before the thaw. And deep within the Scuola Grande di San Rocco, a room that had once been locked for over a year was opened again. It was not the plague hospital, nor the council chamber. It was the music room. Inside were instruments untouched since the first outbreak: violins, lutes, harpsichords, and flutes resting beneath sheets of dust like sleeping pets. A musician named Giordano entered quietly one morning. He did not announce himself. He simply began to tune. His first notes were hesitant, rusted, but the strings held, and then, in the quiet, came harmony. By week's end, others had joined him, musicians who had once filled the opera halls and wedding banquets of the nobility. Now they played for no one, for the walls, for the ghosts, for the idea that beauty had not died with the plague. People began to gather outside the music room, masked and distant, just to listen through the stone. A woman in mourning lace stood every day at the door, and left a white rose at its base, and once, in the middle of a quiet aria, a little girl stepped into the room, danced barefoot across the floor, and then vanished. Without a word. Some said she was real, some said she was not, but no one questioned her belonging, for Venice had become a city where the borders between the living and the lost had blurred. Gently, like ink in water, and perhaps that was the truest healing, not forgetting, not moving on, but learning to carry the dead. With grace, to speak to them, to walk beside them, to let them dance when the music returned. Even the water seemed to understand. It no longer mirrored grief, but carried it. The gondolas, when they passed through certain corners of the city, left ripples shaped like hands. People noticed. No one said anything, but some would bow their heads as they passed. Some whispered names. Some simply wept. But they wept with open eyes and upright spines, because mourning, in Venice, had become sacred. No longer shameful, no longer hidden. It had become part of daily life. And in that rhythm of loss and light, something new began, not a rebirth. Venice did not start over, but she shifted like a tide pulling inward, making space for something unknown. In the final days of the plague's shadow, when the air grew warmer and the bells rang to celebrate a birth instead of mark a death, something extraordinary happened. A wedding, the first in over 2 years, small, quiet, a weaver's son and a glassmaker's daughter. No procession, no feasts, just a ceremony in the garden of the Frari, where lavender grew wild and the benches were worn smooth by grief. The bride wore a gown sewn from old curtains. The groom wore his father's coat. Their guests brought no gifts only. Stories of loved ones lost, of days survived, of nights spent waiting for dawn. And when the couple kissed beneath a sky no longer gray, the city exhaled, not with joy, with something deeper, with memory, because the kiss was not only for love, but for survival. And so it was that Venice, once defined by masks and mirrors, became something more. A city of witness, a city of echoes, a city that did not erase its scars, but traced them with gold, like kintsugi pottery. She stood not restored, but radiant in her ruin, and the plague, though it left her changed, did not defeat her. It only reminded her what mattered. Candles in windows, names spoken aloud, music shared with no audience, bread given without price, stories told without end. Because as long as someone sings or draws, or dreams, Venice will never be silent, and neither will the story. It began with a scent, faint, elusive, like dried rose petals pressed between forgotten pages. It drifted through the kale, those narrow passageways that twisted like old riverbeds, and settled at the edge of Campo Santa Margherita just before dawn. It was not the scent of salt water, nor of mildew, nor even of bread, though those two lingered still. This was different. This was memory made fragrant. Some said it came from the old perfumery near the bridge of the Apostoli, shuttered since the second wave. Others said it was the scent of spring returning not to the season, but to the soul, and still others claimed it was the smell of forgiveness. Whatever it was, it arrived with the warming light, and with it, something stirred in the long-abandoned studios of the Accademia, where painters once crafted masterpieces beneath stained skylights. A woman named Sophia had returned. Her brushes had bristled with cobwebs. Her pigments had dried and cracked, but still she came. Each morning, she cleared a space beside the window and painted not what she saw, but what she remembered. The face of her son, laughing in the rain, the profile of a priest who had buried half the parish, the arches of Rialto, as seen from behind a funeral veil. But she never painted the dead as they were. She painted them in golds and violets, in shapes that shimmered like dreams. When asked why, she said the world had enough shadows, and in Venice, where the shadows had once outnumbered the living, even a single stroke of color was a form of prayer. Her paintings soon found their way into the streets, not in galleries, but tacked to wooden poles, pinned beside church doors, pasted over broken shop fronts. They became offerings, not of commerce, but of comfort. No names were attached, only initials, S.A., and the people knew who it was. Sophia, of the ACCADMIA, saint of pigment and grief. She was not the only one reviving forgotten things. In the crypt beneath the church of San Zaccaria, candles flickered for the first time in nearly 3 years. It had once been a place of stillness, of tombs and relics. But now, in its cool silence, A group of women gathered in secret, not to mourn, but to remember. They recited stories aloud, not prayers, not scriptures, just stories of the baker who sang while kneading, of the midwife who never left her post, of the child who fed pigeons from her window until the very end. They called it La Veglia del Susurro, the vigil of whispers, and every soul was spoken as if it were still near, still warm, still waiting to be remembered. A new kind of ritual, born not of the church, but of the people. It was said that on certain nights, when the air was heavy and still, the voices of the vigil carried up through the grates and vents of the old basilica, making saints weep in their stone niches. Even the bells rang differently now, not from towers, but from boats. Fishermen had begun hanging tiny brass bells on the bows of their skiffs, no louder than a cough. They jingled only when the water was stillest. When asked why, the fishermen said the bells kept the souls company as they passed beneath the surface, not to ward them off, to guide them home. You see, Venice had ceased separating the dead from the living. She'd stopped pretending there was a clean line, and perhaps that was her magic. She allowed them both to exist, in the same breath, in the same mirror, on the same gondola. Even the children began to notice. They, who had once been silenced by fear, now told stories of shadows that sat beside them at supper, of whispers heard beneath bridges, of footprints in the dust that did not match any known shoe. But they did not fear them. They called them I gentili, Grigi the gentle greys, and they left candies on windowsills for them at night. The adults never removed them, not out of belief, but out of reverence, because to tell a child their grief is wrong is to silence a part of yourself you haven't yet faced. So the city began to accept its dual nature, not alive, not dead, but somewhere in between. A breathing elegy. One afternoon, in a plaza near Giudecca, a violinist performed for an audience of none. He stood on a rain-worn crate, his coat threadbare, his shoes cracked, but the music he played was more than melody. It was ritual, a haunting lament that rose and fell like waves crashing against marble. A woman passed and paused, then a child, then a baker, his hands dusted with flour, and soon, without intention, a circle formed. They did not clap, they did not cheer, but when the song ended, every one of them placed something at the violinist's feet. A crust of bread, a drawing, a poem, a ribbon, a handkerchief. No coin, no commerce, just tribute. It was a concert for grief, and it would happen again, in other squares with other musicians, unannounced and unrehearsed. No posters, no names, just sound where there had been silence. Venice was writing its new liturgy, not in Latin, but in gesture, in rhythm, in human pulse, in a palazzo once occupied by bureaucrats, now overtaken by vines and dust. A woman named Marcella started a library, not of books, but of voices. She recorded people, old ones, young ones, those with trembling speech, those who had forgotten how to speak entirely. She asked only one question: "Tell me what you remember." And they did, about love, about loss, about bread rising too slowly during the humid months, about the way their mother hummed when folding laundry, about the color of the sky, the morning their sister didn't wake up. Marcella stored the recordings on wax and paper and scraps of parchment. She called it the Archivio dell'Ombre, the archive of shadows. She said it was for the future, so that when the next silence came, someone might still hear us. Even the dogs in Venice seemed changed. They wandered not with hunger, but with purpose. It was said that if you followed a stray down 3 alleyways and across 2 bridges, it would lead you to someone who needed company. A widow, a child, a man with too many names to remember. And always, when the visit ended, the dog would leave, not waiting for praise, just disappearing into fog. Saints with tails, and muddy paws perhaps. The strangest change of all was the return of Il Carro Bianco, the white cart, once a dreaded sight, drawn by black-cloaked men to carry the infected away. But now, painted anew in white and blue, with lanterns on each corner and flowers in the spokes. It moved through the city not with dread, but with grace. It no longer carried bodies, it carried music, and books, and bread, and sometimes people who simply needed a ride across the lagoon when their strength had failed. It rang no bell, but everyone knew its sound. The creak of reborn wheels, the hush of forgiveness, the promise of movement, even when stillness had ruled for so long. Venice was not what she had been, but perhaps that was never the point. She had always been a shifting thing, built not on solid land but on pylons, driven deep into the unknowable. A city afloat, not only on water, but on memory, and now that memory was sacred, protected, cherished, carried like an ember in the hands of those who knew darkness all too well. So, when the mists rose again, as they always did, there was no fear, only breath, only music, only the gentle echo of footsteps across bridges. Not hurrying, not fleeing, but simply going forward, going home. And Venice watched it all, with ancient eyes, not proud, not mournful, just present, alive, in her own strange way. For as long as we remember, she remembers too. By the time the leaves of the plane trees began to curl inward, as if trying to remember the warmth of summer before they fell, something else was stirring quietly beneath the surface of the city, like a current no one saw but all could feel. Venice had passed through morning like one walks through fog, not knowing where it ends until it lifts now. Something softer was unfolding, not celebration, not rebirth, but recognition. The kind that comes after pain has settled into memory, not vanished. No, but made gentle by time and tenderness. It began with footsteps. A new kind. Lighter. Children were playing again, not many. Not loudly, but in alleyways once silenced by grief. Their laughter rang like wind chimes strung over a graveyard. Hesitant, but real. They skipped rope with frayed cords tied from old prayer. Flags. They drew chalk suns on the walls where water once climbed to drown them. They played games that had no winner-only stories. About sea ghosts and bridge trolls, and the rats that could talk when no one listened. No one stopped them, even the oldest, most wrinkled widow, who had buried 4 sons and forgotten how to smile, stood in her doorway and watched, and when one little girl offered her a dandelion through the gate, she did not cry, she simply touched it, like it might dissolve, like it was made of light. Elsewhere in the city, life was returning, not as a parade, but as a pulse, at the fish market in Rio. Long abandoned stalls opened like eyelids after a long sleep. Not all at once, not with fanfare. But one by one, an old man laid out sardines, glistening like silver threads. A girl, barely. 12 sold lemons from her uncle's garden, each fruit with a name scratched in its rind. A butcher, once feared for his cough, returned to his post with fresh gloves and poems carved into his chopping block. They spoke little, but when coins were exchanged, fingers brushed. Eyes met. And that was language enough. On the island of Murano, the glassmakers lit their furnaces again, not for chandeliers or goblets but for birds, tiny birds of glass, blown with the breath of hands that had buried brothers. Red birds, green birds, birds with cracked wings and uneven tails. They weren't sold. They were left in places that needed them most, tucked into prayer books in empty churches, hung from door frames in plague-washed homes, laid gently on the headstones that bore no names. It became a quiet game, this scattering of color. The secret Venice played with herself. A way to say, you are not alone. Even now, especially now. And the bells had changed again. They rang now not just for death or dawn, but for remembering. Every 7th evening, just as the sun dipped behind the campanile, they told 13 times, once for each month of the worst year. A ritual with no priest, no proclamation. But when they rang all across Venice, people stopped in kitchens, on gondolas, at corners where statues wept. They paused. Some touched their lips. Some touched the stone beside them. Some closed their eyes and whispered names. And then they moved on, but always slower, softer, with reverence. Because silence is not absence, it is presence waiting to be heard. In a modest workshop near San Polo, a woman named Teresa stitched masks, not of fear now, but of remembrance. She used scraps from the linens of plague-rooms, buttons from coats left behind, embroidery drawn from the margins of old medical texts. Each mask bore a symbol: a sun, a sparrow, a crescent moon. They weren't sold, they were given to caretakers, to healers, to those who had never been thanked, because they had never asked. When worn, they made the wearers look less like survivors and more like saints. Not gilded, not adorned, but quiet. Human sacred, and in corners of the city where rot had once reigned. Gardens bloomed, in broken pots, in cracked fountains, in the hollow hulls of gondolas left to die in the marsh. Herbs, wildflowers, mint, basil, foxglove, lavender, some grew by accident, some were planted with trembling hands, and yet all of them flourished, as if the city, weary of breath and blood, had turned to roots instead, as if she knew that the only way forward was downward, into earth, into memory, into stillness. The nights grew longer, but they no longer brought dread down now, when the mists crept in. People opened their shutters. Instead of closing them, they listened for music, for laughter, for footsteps. Of ghosts, they now called neighbors. One evening, in the courtyard of the Ospedale degli Incurabili, a woman in a red cloak began to sing. No one knew her name. Her voice was untrained, raw, but it carried not far but deep. One note folded into another like petals into bloom. A lullaby in a language long dead, the sort spoken by nuns and seabirds and those who speak to the sick when no one else will. And as she sang, a man lit candles along the colonnade, one for each bed, once occupied by the breathless. By midnight, the whole courtyard glowed, and people came, not to perform, not to spectate, but to sit, to listen to, remember, to feel their hearts stretch back toward something soft, and in that light, nothing was forgotten. The names, the faces, the final gasps, the hands held through cloth, they were all there, held not in stone, or ink, or echo, but in light, in flame, and the city breathed. Again, not as before, never as before, but wholly. Venice did not erase what happened. She wove it into bridges, into bells, into bread and lace and birds and chalk. She did not hide her pain. She crowned it with violets, with candle, waxed up with silence, because healing is not the absence of wounds. It is the making of meaning from scars. It is the shaping of a new language. From ashes, it is the whisper beneath every lullaby that says, "We are still here." And so Venice drifts forward, not fast, not loud, but steady. Her streets glisten not from wealth, but from weeping. Her stones speak not in grandeur, but in grace. And every tide that laps at her edge carries with it the memory of the plague, not as punishment, but as proof that even when the ships arrive with death in their hulls, and even when bells ring with the weight of despair, the human heart, fragile, stubborn, beautiful, will find a way to sing again. To plant. To paint, to remember, and to love, even in silence, especially in silence. So sleep now, dear listener. The story is not over. It will never be over, because as long as one soul in Venice whispers the name of another, the city breathes, and so do we. It began again, as all sacred things do, not with thunder, but with a hush, a silence so soft it felt like silk against the skin of the world. The canals were still, not from absence, but reverence, the kind of stillness that comes only when something deeper is listening. Above the rooftops, the stars leaned closer than they had in centuries, no longer distant, no longer burning, but warm, watching, and in the heart of Venice. Beneath the crooked shadow of the church of Santa Maria della Salute, something glowed, not a light, not a candle, but a presence. A woman sat at the water's edge, her hands trailing in the lagoon. She wore a shawl stitched from the fabrics of 20 funerals. She whispered to the water, as if it could answer, and perhaps it did. For beside her, the surface rippled without wind. She sang softly, not for an audience, not even for herself, but for them. For those who had left without goodbyes. For those whose names had been lost to the tide. For those whose bodies had never been found, but whose love lingered in the curve of every stone. Her voice rose like incense. It climbed the dome, slid down the marble balustrades, and entered the city like a secret. One that needed no telling, only feeling. Elsewhere, the gondoliers had begun something new, each night. As dusk deepened into indigo, they offered free crossings not for tourists, not for nobles, but for ghosts. They tied white ribbons to the tips of their poles, a sign to all who knew. They rode slowly, silently, their passengers unseen, but not unwelcomed. And those who watched from windows swore they felt something stir in the air as the boats passed. A chill, a warmth, a memory. A boy on the third floor of a crumbling tenement lit a candle each time a ribboned gondola passed. He had no family left, only a cat, but he said it helped him sleep. "I think my mama's in one of them," he told. "The baker, she likes water." And so the crossings continued. Not for coin, but for peace, at the edges of the city. Where the walls met the marsh, a new tradition took root. They called it La Sera del Letter, the evening of letters, on the first Monday of each month. As the sun bowed low behind the glass islands, Venetians brought slips of paper to the water's edge. They wrote messages. Some were apologies, some were confessions, some were simply names. They folded them, tied them with string, and placed them into little boats made of bark and beeswax. Then, all together, they pushed them into the canal and watched them drift. Hundreds of them, tiny vessels, floating like prayers. Sometimes one would catch fire, not from match or mischief, but seemingly from within. It would flicker, spark, then glow softly before sinking. They said those were the ones that had been heard, and no one cried. Not anymore. They only watched, and breathed, and remembered, in the Campo dei Mori, once abandoned to rats and rot. A strange thing happened. 3 statues began to wear scarves, one red, one blue, one gold. No one knew who did it. Each morning, the scarves were freshly tied. Despite rain or wind, children left sweets in their folds. Old men tipped their hats, and slowly, without anyone deciding, the statues became guardians not of gold, not of trade, but of grief, of endurance, of the ordinary sacred. The mask makers, too, had changed. They no longer sold their work behind glass. They left masks hanging from trees, from doorknobs, from church gates. Some were white, blank, waiting for the wearer to define them. Others were painted with tears, or smiles, or just a single red fingerprint over the mouth. Each one was different. Each one was an invitation to feel too. To remember, and people did. Even the silence changed. Where once it had been a weight, it was now a companion. People sat with it, on docks in pews, beneath arches that had withstood 1,000 tides. They spoke into it. They let it reply. They treated it like a guest not feared, not banished, but welcomed. For silence, like water, reflects most when undisturbed. One evening, on the bridge of the Sighs, a man left a violin, just that. No note, no case, no explanation. By morning, it was gone, not stolen, played because, at midnight, someone had heard its echo. A melody so gentle, it might have been breath, and across the canal, 100 windows had opened, not for spectacle, but for solace. Venice was changing, not erasing, becoming the city. Had decided that memory was not something to be carried, was something to be shared, and so it began to give. In unexpected ways, a loaf of bread left on a windowsill, still warm, a drawing of a ship, tucked beneath a door, a pearl, placed on the edge of a grave, a coin, scratched with initials, dropped into a child's pocket, each one a gesture, each one a vow, to rebuild not the city of before, but the city that could come after. One not built on denial, or grandeur, or illusion, but on gentleness, resilience, truth. One where the dead walked alongside the living. Not haunting, but holding. One where bells rang not for doom, but for dawn. One where even the stones remembered your name. If you touch them with care, and if you listen now truly, listen, you can still hear it. The hush of oars in midnight canals, the hum of lullabies sung to no one, the quiet murmur of stories passed from tongue to tongue like sacred relics. You can feel it in your ribs, in your throat, in the pause between each breath. Venice does not end. She flows, not forward, not back, but inward, downward, deeper, into herself, into us. So sleep now, let her carry you, not as passenger, as part, as whisper, as water, as witness. And when you wake, do not look for proof. Only remember how it felt to be held by a city made of memory, and love, and light, still floating, still grieving, still singing, still here. There are cities that sleep, and there are cities that dream, but Venice remembers. Even now, as the tide laps softly at stone steps, worn by centuries of feet and farewells. Even now, as fog curls like lace around lantern light, the city does not forget, not because she cannot, but because she chooses not to. The plague had long gone. Its ships rotted into the mud. Its breath exhaled into silence. But the shape it carved into the city's soul remained not as a wound, but as a hollow, made holy by time. In the year that followed the long mourning, Venice changed, not overnight, not in spectacle, but like a tide. A moon-guided, soul-bound, rising. She began to tell her story, in pieces, in pulses, in fragments, too soft to be spoken, too sacred to be written. You saw it in the shadow of a bridge, where lovers now left flowers not for romance, but for remembrance. You heard it in the hum of the washerwomen, who sang lullabies once whispered to the dying. You tasted it in the bread baked with rosemary, and salt the herbs of protection, of mourning, of memory. Venice became a city of rituals, of gentle rebellion against forgetting. In the ghetto, Vecchio, where stories had once hidden behind shutters, elders began to speak again. They gathered beneath arches of cracked stone, candles in jars, and told the children everything, about the year of the ships, about the bells that wouldn't stop ringing, about the days when even the birds went silent. The children listened, but wide-hearted, they didn't flinch at the sadness. They nodded, as if their little souls already knew. One girl, small and serious, drew pictures of what she heard, not horrors, but hands, holding hands, eyes closing in peace, a table set for those who never returned. And when she pinned her sketches to the wall, others added theirs. A wall of mourning became a mural of memory, of color, of community, of continuity. The past was not banished, it was painted into presence. Elsewhere, in forgotten churches with moss for carpets and rain for choir, strangers gathered. They didn't speak, they simply sat. Sometimes one would begin to read a psalm, a poem, a grocery list from the week. A husband died, whatever came. The others would listen, not to respond, but to witness. And afterward, someone would light a small oil lamp, place it on the altar, and whisper a single name. The name changed each time, but the silence that followed remained the same. Holding, healing. Healing. Even the gondolas had changed. Many were now painted blue, the color of sea and sky and sorrow. Their seats lined with linen, embroidered with tiny moons. The gondoliers no longer sang for show. They hummed, a low rippling sound, like memory moving through water. Tourists didn't understand, but Venetians knew it was a lullaby for the city herself, for her bones, for her bruises, for her breath in the Palazzo Ducale. A hall once reserved for power, the Doge made a quiet decree. One night each year, all lights would go dark. No candles, no lamps, no torches. The city would go still, and everyone, rich or poor, old or young, would sit in silence. For 13 minutes, one for each moon of the plague year. They called it La Notte del Respiro, the night of the breath. No bells, no clocks, just stillness. And in that stillness, something opened. A window, a wound, a wound, a wonder. People said they felt their ancestors with them. Not ghosts, not visions. Just ... closeness, as if the air itself had turned to memory. As if the city exhaled. And all who had loved and lost were carried with it. And when the 13th minute passed, someone, somewhere, would strike a single bell, and all of Venice would begin. Again, not loudly, not in celebration, but in continuation. Because healing is not an end, it is an honoring, and Venice had learned how to honor, in the scent of lavender, left on thresholds, in the music of spoons tapping glasses at supper, in the rhythm of steps, echoing through empty squares, once filled with fear. There was no monument built for the plague, no towering marble, no list of names carved in brass. The city itself had become the memorial, each stone, each stair, each ripple of canal, every breath drawn after sorrow, a living testament to survival, to sorrow, to softness, and to stillness, the kind that does not numb, but nourishes. There were rumors, of course, of a woman in red who walks the canal at night, singing to the water, of a ghost ship that appears on fog-heavy mornings, only to vanish at the sound of bells, of a boy who leaves white roses on the doorstep, of every home that lost someone, even now. All these years later, no one knows who he is, but they always leave their door unlocked the night before, just in case. Because Venice believes in presence, in persistence, in the holiness of small things, done with great care at the city's edge, where lagoon kisses land and salt meets soil. A garden grows wild, untamed, full of herbs used during the plague, in every spring. The children of the city come, they scatter seeds, they tie ribbons to the branches, they sit among the bees and tell stories, and when they leave, they whisper to the leaves, "We remember," because they do, because they must, because forgetting would be the second death. But remembering, that is resurrection. So now, if you ever come to Venice, walk slowly, touch the stones with your palm, stand beneath the bridges, and listen to the echoes. Sit at the edge of the water, and watch the way it glimmers like glass over tears, and know that this city, this floating cathedral of memory, holds you not because you belong to her, but because she belongs to everyone who has ever loved and lost and loved again. Venice is not a place. She is a breath, a heartbeat, a lullaby sung after the crying has stopped, a soft voice saying, "You are not alone." And now, dear listener, rest. Let the waters carry you. Let the fog enfold you. Let the bells lull you into the quiet where memory becomes dream. The story is over, but the remembering never ends. Close your eyes, breathe deep and drift, for the plague ships are gone, but Venice remains, still floating, still glowing, still loving, still here forever.